Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our breakout session today. I know there's still a few more people trickling in, but we're going to get started. Our breakout session today is responding to high-risk behavior in FTD. My name is Ann Schoonover, and I'm the helpline specialist here at AFTD. This session will be recorded and available on our website after the conference. Participants will be muted for the duration of the presentation, but you can submit questions in the chat as you think of them. Dr. Pilcher won't be reading the chats coming through as she is presenting, but AFTD staff are behind the scenes to help and share questions for the end as time allows. As always, our helpline is available after the conference to discuss any individual situations. You will also find many helpful resources in your app and also on AFTD's website. And with that, welcome again. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Pilcher, who will be presenting on responding to high-risk behavior in FTD. Dr. Pilcher is a gerontologist and the founder of Clear Guidance, a care management organization with a special focus on young onset and less common forms of dementia, such as FTD. Prior to founding Clear Guidance in 2018, Dr. Pilcher has had career-long experience in supporting persons living with dementia and their families, as well as involvement in professional organizations in leadership, policy, and fundraising. Her full bio can be found in the program. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pilcher, who will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everyone at AFTD for having me today. I'm honored to be part of this fabulous event. I am going to just share my screen here so I can bring my slides up. Give me 1 second. Here we go. All right. Today, we're going to discuss some very difficult topics. Unusual and high-risk behaviors are extremely challenging, especially for care partners. We're going to discuss things like improper social behavior, disrobing in public, aggression, irrational or illegal acts, and inappropriate sexual behavior. These topics can be uncomfortable to discuss. Often people with FTD and their care partners are ashamed or embarrassed to discuss these issues and feel alone in dealing with them. I want you to know that I and my team work with people with FTD and their care partners every day that are dealing with and learning to respond to the very same issues you may be facing. I am hoping through our discussion today, you will be comforted by seeing the number of people that have joined us to learn about this challenging topic. You are not alone. As we go through this, please don't be reluctant to ask questions, even if they are hard to ask. The most important first step in managing the difficult symptoms of FTD is to understand where the symptoms come from. As you all know by now, FTD attacks the frontal lobes of the brain in a very different way than other types of dementia do. The frontal lobe, which is part of the prefrontal cortex, plays a big role in the brain. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for empathy, insight, response flexibility, emotional and body regulation, morality, intuition, and certain aspects of thoughtful communication. It has also been called the gatekeeper of the brain. Among the most important roles of the prefrontal cortex is its management in the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight response. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that tells the limbic system whether or not there is actually a threat. For all of us, not just those with FTD, when you sense danger, the limbic system fires up. This is an actual chemical reaction that causes real changes in your body. Your heart rate increases, your body starts pumping adrenaline, muscles tense, it can seem hard to breathe, your pupils dilate, and your vision is narrowed. The brain literally goes into survival mode. You lose the ability to be rational and may perceive situations as more negative than they actually are. This is a stress response that can take 20 to 30 minutes to subside. And that's for those of us who are not impacted by FTD. Our ancestors developed the stress response to help us survive. This is helpful in prehistoric days when danger was all around us. Threats were constant. You didn't know where your next meal was coming from. You had to brave the weather, and you had to fight off predators who are ready to pounce. Nowadays, we don't have that reality, so it's not so helpful to have this reaction. For people with FTD, the alarm system in the stress response is even more sensitive than for the rest of us. The limbic system is firing away, setting off the alarm for the brain. For those of us with healthy brains, the prefrontal cortex, our gatekeeper, would step in and help reassure us that there isn't a threat, or that what appeared threatening isn't as dangerous as it appears. However, for people with FTD, the part of the brain has been damaged, the prefrontal cortex, and may not be able to moderate the sense of threat. Additionally, for people with FTD, we see significant changes in many areas: personality change, apathy, loss of sympathy and empathy, loss of executive function, as well as a loss of impulsivity and disinhibition. Impulsivity and disinhibition are the symptoms of frontal lobe damage that cause the biggest issues for high-risk behavior. Impulsivity is driven by an immediate urge to gratify a need or desire. People who are impulsive tend to rapidly react to internal or external stimuli without considering the consequences of their actions. Not only does FTD affect your ability to inhibit your urges, but for many people with FTD, there is also a lack of insight about the behaviors or even the recognition that they are occurring. This lack of insight is often referred to as anosognosia. This is not denial, but an actual inability to recognize the symptoms are occurring or how they are affecting other people. In order for us to be successful at responding to these behaviors, we must first accept that it may be difficult or impossible for the person with FTD to recognize their behavior is inappropriate, to stop themselves from acting on their impulses, or to change their behavior accordingly. In essence, our gatekeeper has left his or her post. And as happened to this poor gatekeeper in England several years ago in 2019, he simply passed out from exhaustion. As a neurologist I work with here in Boston likes to say, having FTD is like having a car that is all gas and no brakes. I'm pausing here as I hope a few of you are laughing at this picture. It is very important when we're dealing with these difficult topics to keep your sense of humor, which is why I included it. Okay, so what can we do to respond to high-risk behavior? The first thing we want to think about is how we can proactively address mood for people with FTD. The first thing we can do to proactively address mood is the issue of control. In my work, myself and my team have seen time and time again that frustration and agitation can be the result of a person with FTD feeling a loss of control or choice. Finding ways to promote and create opportunities for choice and control is vitally important. Second, we need to make sure that we are addressing all of the dimensions of mood stability. Myself and my team recently read this book called The Dementia Concept by Joshua Freitas. Josh talks about the 4 dimensions of stability for mood for a person with dementia. I really like the way he lays out this discussion because it gives us a good visuals for what we should be thinking about in terms of proactive measures we can take to decrease the chances of experiencing challenging behavior. Probably the most effective way to decrease difficult behavior is to make sure that persons with FTD are continuing to engage in physical activity. The more vigorous the exercise, the more effective it will be in maintaining a stable mood. There are mountains of evidence to suggest that regular, vigorous exercise improves brain function and increases stability of mood and behavior. Next, Josh talks about the importance of maintaining social interaction and engagement. He gives lots of ideas in his book about how to do this, but one that I find particularly interesting is the idea of helping. For many, being able to play a role, complete a task, help others, and receive thanks gives them the opportunity to be independent and important. Helping is a behavior that not only promotes social interaction, but also releases serotonin, which helps to improve your mood. Social interaction and activity should also include intellectual stimulation and new learning. This is especially true for those with FTD, for whom memory loss is not often a primary symptom, and new learning is possible for a substantial amount of time. For many with FTD, expressing and processing emotions can be challenging. Participating in traditional talk therapy may be difficult or impossible and ineffective. It is important to provide people with FTD alternative options for processing emotions. A lot of research has shown that activities such as art-based expression or expressive therapy can help people with FTD to process emotional challenges in a healthy way. Studies have shown that during and after this kind of therapy, people with FTD experience an increase in dopamine, a natural chemical that helps people relax. This is why my practice and many others have started to offer expressive therapy as part of our services. I want to warn you that this book has a lot to offer, but it wasn't written specifically for people with FTD and was written primarily for caregivers working in residential placements. However, I do think it has some very helpful suggestions about how you can go about incorporating these ideas into your daily routine and activities for people with FTD, and I would recommend giving it a review. You can find it on Amazon if you're interested. Okay, so what else can we do? Now we've talked about how to proactively address this and set ourselves up for success. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how to identify triggers for this high-risk behavior. In order to do that, you need to don your detective hat. We want to start by ruling out any contributing factors that could be playing a role in the behavior that you're witnessing. I've given you some examples here of what to look for. So we're looking for untreated or undertreated pain. Have there been any medication changes? Are there any medical conditions, new or existing? What does this person's sleep pattern look like, and can that be improved? And have there been any sensory changes in terms of hearing, vision, touch, taste, anything like that that could be contributing? And we want to rule those things out. If you're not sure if you're dealing with one of these issues, charting and logging information can help you identify that. In our practice, we use a variety of methods, including bowel and bladder charts, sleep logs, medication side effect charts, etc. I've given you 2 examples here on the screen of some of the charting and logging tools that we use. It's important not to make assumptions. I've heard stories about, I haven't had a client, but I've heard stories about persons with FTDs who have been perceived as hypersexual when in fact their behavior was due to discomfort they were experiencing. For example, I was told about a female client with FTD whose family believed that she was masturbating excessively, and they were really disturbed by this. However, once they did an evaluation and a full medical workup, they realized that in fact that person had an infection that was uncomfortable. And once they treated the infection, the behavior stopped. So it's very important to make sure we're examining these things first. Next, you want to ask yourself, is there an emotional need that is not being met for the person with FTD? In addition to the ones listed here, we like to think about the possibility of fear, loss, loneliness, or boredom being a potential factor that could be contributing to the behavior you're witnessing. In doing your detective work, it's important to clearly identify the problem or the behavior that you're seeing. You want to gather as much information as you possibly can about when, why, and how this behavior is occurring. In our practice, there are two tools we use to help with this kind of detective work. The first one is this that I have on the screen that's called an ABC chart, or an antecedent behavior and consequence chart. This is actually a tool that was developed for working with children with autism, but we and many others in the field have found this to be an effective tool when you're trying to identify what the triggers for a certain behavior might be. This kind of chart helps you to describe what came before the behavior, what's the potential trigger, what the behavior was specifically, and what happened immediately after the behavior occurred. I gave you a link on the bottom of this slide, and I'm sure my slides will be available to you after the fact, where you can find this kind of chart online. We have also recently adopted something called the DICE approach. The DICE approach was developed by Dr. Helen Kales and her team at UC Davis. The DICE approach is a process of investigating behaviors and creating interventions to address those behaviors. The DICE approach uses a 4-step process that gives you helpful information about what to think about and look for. I've given you their website here on this slide. They also have a book called The DICE Approach that is available both on their website as well as on Amazon. One of the nicer things about signing up for their website is they give you a handy dandy worksheet that helps you to work through the investigation that you're doing. This is just the first page of that worksheet, but they give you, I think there's about 6 pages in the worksheet that guide you through the steps of evaluating and what you want to be looking at and how you want to be doing that. Our team has found this very helpful in looking at high-risk behavior and what we might do to intervene. Okay, so we've maybe at this point identified what the triggers might be for a certain high-risk behavior that you're seeing. Most often, the answer to avoiding triggers is to change the environment around the person with FTD. I'm going to talk to you, whoops, my examples are a little out of order. I apologize. This is example 1. I'm going to give you some examples of what it means to change the environment, cases and things that we have worked on where we've found changing the environment to be effective. In some cases, it can be as simple as just removing the trigger. We had a client recently with FTD that was drinking to excess and becoming violent against his care partner. Although it was not an easy process, we were able to work with the care partner and the physician to gradually wean the client off of alcohol and then remove the alcohol entirely from his home. This was hard, especially for the care partner and their family. It required significant lifestyle changes on the part of the care partner and the larger family, including not having events either in their home or other people's homes that included alcohol, not patronizing alcohol, restaurants that serve alcohol, and making other people in their social community aware of the fact that they were not going to be in those kinds of situations anymore. But it did work. to avoid further harm to the person and their care partner. Another example, we had a client we were working with who got very agitated in the car. And while sitting in the passenger seat, would often either grab the steering wheel and attempt to change the way they were driving, or would open the passenger door while the car was still in motion. As you can imagine, this was very scary for the care partner and made her think she could no longer take the person with FTD in the car with her. The solution turned out to be activating the child locks in the car and having the person with FTD sit in the back seat. And it didn't eliminate the agitation with driving altogether, but it increased the safety for both the care partner and the person with FTD, and allowed us to have something to do to allow them to still be able to go places together in the car. Last example I'll give you about changing the environment is a client we had who was disrobing in public. As you can imagine, this was upsetting and embarrassing for everybody involved. We worked on several solutions in terms of identifying which public places this was most likely to happen, what the warning signs were that this was about to happen, and trying to intervene before it did. However, the real change came when we made changes to the person's clothing. First, we made sure that the clothing was not too tight or uncomfortable, including removing all the tags from the clothing. So we were looking at what could possibly be, spurring this behavior. Next, we made sure that the client was dressed in layers that were easy to take off or put on if the weather changed. So we were controlling for the idea that if the person was hot, they had a way of taking one layer off and there was still another layer underneath. And even with these changes, we were still seeing this occur. And so the last thing that we did is there are these jumpsuits that can be worn underneath clothes that only fasten in the back. And so we were able to have the person, when they were going out in public, wear this jumpsuit so that even if they were disrobing, it gave us some time to calmly redirect this person to a private space where we could work through what the issue was. And so those are some examples of what we can do to help change the environment around people who are experiencing this kind of behavior. I'm sure you've heard in other sessions, and I know that you've heard, if you've had any learning at all about FTD, that a lot of what we need to do is moderate our responses to the behavior that we're seeing. And I also know that this is easier said than done. But I think I'll briefly just go through the highlights here. Staying calm, as difficult as that may be, and speaking softly and without emotion is essential in your response. If you are concerned about aggression, creating distance at least 5 feet between you and the person with FTD is especially important. And you might want more than 5 feet if you really are concerned about physical contact. It's also good for respecting the reaction, the emotional reaction the person is having, that you're not getting too close in social space for them. Reflect the observed emotion. What is that person expressing in that moment? And acknowledge the discomfort they're experiencing if they are experiencing discomfort. Whatever you do, don't challenge the person's reality or try to rationalize with them. Relax your facial expression and body language. Make eye contact. Don't do what this man here in the picture is doing, right? Simplify your language. If you talk too much, it can make you sound nervous and can actually lead to the person feeling paranoid. So try to use simplified language that is easily understood. And my favorite, if it's possible and safe, remove yourself from the situation if you feel unsafe or you feel that your responses thus far have not led to the person being able to calm down. This is called resign and reapproach. Come back later. Remember that discussion we had at the beginning of the presentation about the limbic system response. And remember that we talked about it can take 20 to 30 minutes for that chemical reaction, that adrenal response to subside. You need to give time for that to occur. And as long as it's safe and appropriate, it's a good idea to give that person the space so that that chemical reactions can subside, and then you can try again to address the situation. For care partners, whether you're a family member or a professional care partner, be aware of your own attitudes and feelings in response to the behavior you are experiencing. It's very hard when you see some of these shocking and upsetting behaviors to respond as I just described in the last slide. Being a care partner is stressful. As you can see from this example, in this study, 38% of caregivers reported feeling highly stressed due to caregiving responsibilities. My guess is it's a lot higher than that. Be aware of your own stress levels. Practice stress management and relief so you are able to respond in a thoughtful way. If you are calm, you're more likely to promote calm in your partner with FTD. I know what I'm suggesting is not easy, and you've probably heard it before, but it is essential to your survival as a care partner. Okay, so we've talked about methods for decreasing the chances of difficult behavior, ways to identify and mitigate triggers, and how to moderate your responses to these behaviors. But what if you've done all these things and you're still experiencing these challenges? Now what? It is very important for you to know, sometimes no matter how hard we try with these non-pharmacological interventions or how creative we are about avoiding triggers, we simply cannot stop these behaviors with non-pharmacological approaches. If that is the case, it's time to bring in the professional life-saving techniques. Although medications are not the only answer, they are a valuable tool we have for addressing high-risk behaviors. I'm not a psychiatrist or a neurologist, and I would never dare to advise on prescribing, but I can talk to you about classes of medications I have seen prescribed and some general information about it. I want to demystify this a little bit for you so that if you are in the position of needing to consider this, it's something you've already heard about and can feel comfortable with. When we have high-risk behavior, it is not recommended to use the class of drugs that's called benzodiazepines. This class, sometimes called benzos, can cause further disinhibition and cognitive decline and is not generally a good suggestion. So if you have a neurologist or a psychiatrist that is recommending a benzodiazepine to you, get a second opinion. It may be necessary, but it generally is not recommended. There's a class of drugs called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This class of medications have been some of the best that I've seen in decreasing things like aggressiveness, inappropriate behaviors, disinhibition, repetitive or sexually inappropriate behaviors. So an example is citalopram, but there are lots. There are many in this class, and what you use and how you use it is really something you want to talk with a neurologist or a psychiatrist about. There's also a class of drugs called PRIs, presynaptic reuptake inhibitors. Most typically, we see trazodone being prescribed in this class, and it's used to treat aggression, agitation, insomnia, and some eating abnormalities. Next, we have antipsychotics, which are a class of medications that are used to manage psychosis. So delusions, hallucinations, disordered thought, but are also being used in non-psychotic disorders where there is severe distress or risk of physical harm to others. This is generally a last resort, but is sometimes necessary, especially with a lot of really extreme behavior. The last is this class of drugs called anti-androgens, which is a class of medications that act by reducing testosterone levels, which may reduce hypersexuality and aggressiveness. They also impair sexual functioning. So it's something to be very careful with, but is something I've seen prescribed in situations where you have hypersexuality as an issue. Bottom line is this: if you're dealing with high-risk behavior, don't be afraid to discuss these possibilities with your neurologist or psychiatrist. Not only can it be helpful, but it can also make the non-pharmacological interventions we discussed earlier more successful. You may also, at certain times in your journey, need to consider psychiatric hospitalization, assistance from law enforcement and/or protective services, or placement in a residential setting. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of times we've done this with clients where it has led to favorable outcomes in the long run. We had a client in his early 60s who was diagnosed with FTD, who was highly socially inappropriate, aggressive, and was involved in multiple thefts. This client had a side to him that was very generous. He would burn music CDs in his house and take them out in public and hand them to people. As well, he would give away hundreds of dollars in cash to strangers on the street every day. He was a veteran and would go to local bars and get right in people's faces, fervently talking about his service. If they didn't respond the way he wished, he would end up in fistfights with patrons. He would also walk into stores, taking things off the shelves and putting them in his pockets, then walk out. When his wife tried to address or stop these behaviors, he got very angry and aggressive. At one point, he threw a hot cast iron pot at his wife, breaking her leg. There were several arrests and interactions with law enforcement. Unfortunately, in this situation, none of the proactive or response strategies we discussed earlier were effective. As well, pharmaceutical interventions were impossible as he refused to take medication or took it incorrectly or inconsistently. In this case, we needed to involve both protective services as well as law enforcement to help us address the issue. We worked with the family to understand both the need for hospitalization and then what we would do once our client was hospitalized to address this situation. After a lot of hard work and many attempts, we were able to get him to the hospital, get him appropriately medicated, and he was able to return home, where he is living today successfully with his wife and supplemental support from a home health agency. So an example of how, even though it's not ideal, it can have a favorable outcome and is really needed in some cases. Second example I'm going to give you is a client we had in his late 60s who was living in New Hampshire and had been diagnosed with FTD. Client had previously been divorced and was currently in a relationship with his girlfriend of 10 years. The girlfriend had recently kicked him out of the house because he had become sexually aggressive. In addition, he was taking inappropriate pictures of children in their bathing suits, approaching children in public, and giving children gifts. He had lost his job due to posting inappropriate things on social media. We worked with a psychiatrist to change his medications to address this, but he was unable to be completely compliant with the medications, and the psychiatrist no longer felt comfortable prescribing, knowing that he wasn't taking them accurately and consistently. In this case, we worked with the neurologist and the psychiatrist to build the case for issuing an order for him to be hospitalized, which in Massachusetts is called a Section 12. In other places, it may be called something else. Once we got him hospitalized, we were able to treat the symptoms and place him in a residential setting, and he still lives there and continues to do well. So the takeaway message here is that the perspective that is helpful is one of learning from the experiences we are having. I love this quote from Nelson Mandela. I never lose, I either win or I learn. And that is really the attitude we have to adopt when we're working with these high-risk behaviors. We need to learn, we need to pay attention, we need to investigate, and then we need to be open to the possible solutions that are out there and see these opportunities where we see these behaviors as opportunities to learn more about how we can help the person that's experiencing them. Okay, so that's the end of my formal presentation. I'd love to hear questions and comments that you might have.
Dr. Pilcher, thank you so much for this really important discussion. You have a lot of topics that I think people feel so isolated when they're facing them, but to know that these are unfortunately things that can happen, that they're not alone. So we do have a few questions to begin with. You had touched a bit about driving. So I have a question that my husband's license has been taken away, but he is still trying to drive. Do you have suggestions of how we can keep him from driving?
Yeah, this is a tricky, driving is a tricky issue across the board for lots of families, and I'm not surprised that you're facing this. I think that when we're talking about removing triggers, sometimes what we're talking about is removing access to something that is dangerous. And so you may need to think about how you can remove access to the car, whether you remove the car as sometimes just having a car in the driveway that you used to drive can be a real trigger for why can't I drive the car? We can't expect that the person with FTD is necessarily going to understand why they can't continue driving. May not make sense to them. And so we really have to, again, that goes to changing the environment, right? What can we do about the access to the car? So often we work with families on how we can remove the car in a way that will be respectful, but also increase the safety and reduce the very visual, very evident symbol of the loss of driving. I think it's also very important wherever you can, and I don't know where you live, where you're asking this question. This is easier in some places than others, but it's always important to introduce a substitution. If you can't drive yourself, who can drive you? Who can get you where you need to go? So that the not driving doesn't limit what that person can engage in socially or productively. So that's an important piece of this as well, is introducing a transportation substitution when you don't have driving as an option any longer.
Great, thank you so much. And I know we talked about how there are some situations, in an inpatient stay may be necessary. And, we know that in some areas of the country, there may only be certain options that, may not have specific experience, with FTD or even dementia. Do you have suggestions of how to advocate or educate the facility about your loved one's needs?
Absolutely. And I know this is a big problem in many areas of the country. I think, one of the things that's really important to know about hospitalization is it's not just the person goes to the ER and everything gets taken care of from there. Actually, the work begins when the person hits the ER. You need to be present as the care partner and advocate to explain to the staff in the emergency room what has been happening, why this has been happening. If you can provide documentation, I encourage a lot of our caregivers to log or journal what they're experiencing and when they're experiencing it. That can be very helpful for medical staff that really doesn't understand FTD. I also think be prepared when you think this might be something you need to utilize as a tool. Be prepared with information on FTD. Have it with you when you go to the hospital so that you can hand it over to a provider that might not be educated. Also, if this is somewhere that someone is going to be staying for some length of time, right? If this is either a geri, sometimes we end up in geri psychiatric units because that's where people with dementia are often sent. Call the FTD Association. Call in Massachusetts. We have MGH has an FTD clinic. They will do some education with those providers if they're open to it about FTD and how it differs from other types of dementia. But I think we have to proactively educate about this because people really don't understand. That's very true. Even people that should.
I think we have time for just one more question. Do you have suggestions, in some of these situations, they are, at home, with spouses and, people may not know how to talk about this, share about it with other family members, or even if you're out in the community and something happens, what can we say, to those in our social circles, to help them better understand when the person with FTD may be making inappropriate comments or even becoming agitated when we're out in the community.
Right. So I have a couple of suggestions. Number one is, today I've presented to you some of the real education around this. Why is this happening to this person's brain? And I hope that you will take some of that information and share it with other people about the fact that the damage in FTD is really in the frontal lobe, which is responsible for impulse control. And that is where it is different than other dementias. And these behaviors that people are exhibiting are not their fault and it's not in their control. And I think that's the big message. And please feel free to share any slide I have that might be helpful in educating people out there in the community that might need to know more about this. Show them this presentation. I also think we have had really good success in creating caregiver cards. I don't know if AFTD has this as a resource. If not, I'm happy to send you. If you're out in public or you're in an airport or in a restaurant or something like that, often we will create these cards for our clients that say the person I'm with has a brain disorder or neurological disorder that affects judgment, impulse control, that kind of thing. And so you can hand it to the person in the airport or the person in the line ahead of you in the grocery. And so that can help bring attention, and have patience from people that are experiencing this out in public. So I think with family and friends, it's more of a proactive education approach in letting people know what's going on. And then in the moment, having, these are really cute. They're like this big business cards. They can go right in your wallet and you can pull them out and hand them to somebody and say, without saying anything in front of the person with FTD, you can just hand this card over that says, please be patient. This person has a neurological disorder, and that's helped.
Thank you very much. We Stephanie has dropped in our chat too, the AFTD awareness cards, and also a behavior tracker that AFTD has just recently put out to help families as well. So thank you all for joining us today. These are topics that are just so difficult to talk about, and I hope you leave today knowing that you are not alone. I encourage you to think about getting connected with others with an FTD support option by visiting our website or reaching out to us on the helpline. In a moment or two, we will head back to the main session, and we thank you again for coming to this breakout today. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.